Picture this. You have two completely terrified children standing in a 12th century English wheat field.
Yeah, right in the middle of harvest season.
Exactly. And they speak this totally alien language. They're wearing clothes made of some unidentifiable rigid fabric. And their skin, this is the crazy part, their skin is a bright, unmistakable green.
It's such a striking image.
It is. I mean, do you think this is just a fairy tale, right? Like some bedtime story meant to keep kids from wandering off into the woods at night.
Oh, for sure. That's what you'd assume.
But the mystery we are unpacking from your sources today was actually recorded as absolute, verifiable fact. And not just by anyone, but by the most skeptical, rigorous historians of the Middle Ages.
Right.
So welcome to the deep dive. We're looking at a stack of historical documents today that describe an event that completely shattered the reality of the people who witnessed it. And, frankly, it's something that continues to baffle historians and medical professionals nearly 1,000 years later. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's do it. Because the tension between the fantastical nature of that image and the incredibly sober, bureaucratic way it was documented, that's what makes this specific case so unique in the historical record.
It's not just a myth, then.
No, not at all. We aren't dealing with a myth that just sort of evolved over centuries of oral tradition. We are looking at a highly localized, bizarre event from the mid-1100s, and it was treated by contemporaries as, well, basically as breaking local news. Yeah, it's this anomaly that actively resists being neatly filed away, even when we throw modern scientific scrutiny at it. To really grasp the gravity of this, we have to kind of strip away our modern preconceptions.
Right, get into their headspace.
Exactly. We have to immerse ourselves in the exact moment of discovery. And we're doing that by relying on two distinct, independent medieval chronicles, the Historia Rerum Anglicarum and the Chronicon Anglicanum.
Which are huge sources for this.
They are, and these texts, they don't present the event as folklore, they present it as a literal disruption of the natural order.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We're going to explore how a local mystery from 9 centuries ago holds its ground against modern historical and medical scrutiny. We're not trying to force a clean, modern resolution here.
Right, no neat little bow.
Exactly. So let's put ourselves right in that disruption. It is late summer. We are in the rural village of Woolpit in Suffolk, England. It's harvest time.
So everyone is out working.
Yep. The entire village is out in the field swinging scythes, bringing in the wheat. And, the name Woolpit itself is a massive clue to the psychology of this place.
Oh, absolutely. It's fascinating.
It derives from the Old English for wolf pits. These were literal deep trenches dug at the very edge of the village, right near the tree line, to trap wolves and protect the livestock.
And that boundary is so crucial.
It is. Because right where the tamed, civilized farmland meets the dark, untamed, dangerous woods, that is exactly where these children suddenly appeared.
Yeah, that geographical detail is vital. Because in the medieval mindset, the boundary of the village wasn't just a property line, it was a psychological border.
Like a barrier against the unknown.
Precisely. Inside the village was order, the church, known reality. Outside, out in the deep forests, was chaos, outlaws, and potentially, the supernatural.
Right.
The wolf pits represent that liminal space. So when the harvest workers look up and see two children crawling out of those very pits, they're seeing something emerging from the absolute edge of their known universe.
That would be terrifying.
So incredibly jarring. The sudden intrusion of the unknown right into their mundane daily labor.
I can only imagine the sound of the harvest just grinding to a complete halt. The scythes stop, the murmuring starts.
I'm just staring.
Yeah. The villagers cautiously walk over, and they are confronted with 3 distinct things that just completely break their understanding of the world.
3 massive red flags.
Right. First, the clothing. The text explicitly mentioned the strange weave and cut of the children's garments. Now, in a rural 12th century village, literally everybody knows exactly how fabric is made.
Oh, yeah. It was their whole livelihood.
They know their local sheep. They know how wool is spun, how it's dyed with local plants and woven on local looms. But these kids, a boy and a girl, they're wearing something totally foreign.
Right, and the chronicles describe the fabric as being of an unknown color and strange material. We really have to remember that textile production was the absolute center of the medieval domestic economy.
So they weren't just guessing.
No, not at all. A Suffolk farmer might not know how to read Latin, but they were experts in cloth. If they couldn't identify the weave, it means it wasn't just slightly different. It was likely produced using manufacturing techniques or dyes that simply didn't exist in their regional trade network.
It marked them as outsiders instantly.
Instantly, even before they opened their mouths.
Which brings us to the second pillar of this encounter, the language. The boy and the girl are terrified, they're clinging to each other, and they're crying out to the villagers. But it's an entirely unintelligible babble.
Completely alien to them.
Yeah, let's think about the linguistic landscape of England in the mid-1100s. You have the local peasants speaking early Middle English. You have the nobility and the knights speaking Norman French, since the Norman conquest was only a few generations prior.
Right.
And then you have the clergy speaking and writing in Latin. So the villagers' ears are tuned to recognize, or at least identify the rhythm of, those three distinct linguistic families.
Yes.
But this language sounded like absolutely none of them.
And the isolation of a medieval village meant that foreign languages weren't just unfamiliar, they were often perceived as inherently threatening or unnatural.
Like something was deeply wrong.
Exactly. The chroniclers note how frantically the children spoke. It wasn't just that the words were wrong. The cadence, the vowel sounds, the entirely different linguistic structure, it would have sounded utterly alien to ears, accustomed only to the heavy Germanic roots of rural Suffolk dialects.
And then we get the absolute kicker. The thing that turns this from a story of lost foreigners into an enduring historical mystery.
The main event.
Right. Their skin is green. Not pale, not bruised, not seasick looking. The texts specifically describe their skin tone as a distinct, unmistakable green.
This is the detail that prevents us from simply filing this away as a mundane story of lost travelers. Every single surviving primary source agrees on this specific pigmentation.
It's the core of the whole thing.
It's the anchor of the mystery. In 900 years of historical analysis, no credible scholar had managed to brush the green skin aside as just a mere translation error or some poetic embellishment by the chroniclers.
They were very literal about it.
Highly literal, the Latin texts are unambiguous.
You know, if I try to map this onto our modern world, it's tough because we are so saturated with media. I mean, ask yourself, how would you react if you found something utterly inexplicable in your own backyard?
It's a great question.
Like if I walked into my backyard and found a glowing green extraterrestrial, I would be terrified, obviously. But my brain has a cultural file for alien. I've seen sci-fi movies. I know the trope.
Right, you have a reference point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These 12th century farmers had no cultural file for this. Their world was the soil, the changing of the seasons, and the strict hierarchy of the feudal system. To see green humans stepping out of a wolf pit wasn't just weird. It was an existential shock. They were looking at something that defied the laws of biology as they understood them.
And yet, what is profoundly interesting about their reaction is what they didn't do.
Right.
They didn't assume the children were demons and attack them. Despite this terrifying breach of reality, the villagers' baseline humanity just kicked in.
Which is pretty amazing for the time.
It really is. They recognized the vulnerability of the boy and the girl. They were bewildered, yes, but they gathered the children up and decided to take them to the local authority, rather than resorting to the kind of mob violence that fear of the unknown so often triggers.
Okay, wait, hold on. I need to push back in this narrative flow for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
Because I'm looking at the timeline provided in the sources. The texts place this event during the reign of King Stephen, which spans from 1135 to 1154.
That's right.
That specific 20-year period is known to historians as the Anarchy. This wasn't a peaceful time of quiet village life. The whole country was practically lawless, just tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war.
King Stephen and Empress Matilda.
Right. Barons were slaughtering each other, burning crops, building unauthorized castles to terrorize the countryside. So why on earth are we trusting medieval chroniclers writing in the middle of a literal war zone? Doesn't the chaos of the anarchy make this more likely to be just a panicked ghost story?
That is the exact instinct a historian should have. But what's fascinating here is that the reality is quite the opposite. The anarchy is precisely what gives this story its grounding.
Wait, really? How so?
Let's look closely at the men who wrote this down. The first is William of Newburgh. He wasn't some peasant passing on a local rumor. He was an Augustinian canon from the 12th century.
Okay, for those of us who aren't medieval theologians, what does that actually mean? Is that like a monk locked away in a scriptorium somewhere?
Close, but with a crucial difference. A canon was an ordained priest who lived in a community under a strict religious rule, much like a monk. However, while monks traditionally isolated themselves from the world in cloisters to pray, Augustinian canons were very public-facing.
Oh, okay.
They often ran hospitals, they served local parishes, and they engaged deeply with the outside world. William was writing during what we call the 12th century Renaissance, which was a period of massive intellectual revival in Europe.
So he was a smart guy.
Highly educated, he was familiar with classical logic, and he developed a fierce reputation as a careful, skeptical historian, a proto-scientific historian even.
So he wasn't just uncritically writing down every magical fairy tale he heard.
Far from it. William actively despised Marvel stories. In his other writings, he famously launched this scathing attack on Geoffrey of Monmouth, the writer who popularized the King Arthur legends.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he basically called Geoffrey a liar who made up history for entertainment. William's stated methodology was to rely on verifiable facts, multiple witnesses, and sober analysis. So when a man who actively hates fairy tales stakes his academic reputation on the story of the Green Children...
You have to pay attention.
Exactly. By including it in his serious historical chronicle, we have to pause and take it seriously.
And he had backup, right? There was a second source to corroborate this.
Yes, Ralph of Coggeshall. He was a Cistercian abbot writing a bit later, in the early 13th century, at an abbey about 30 miles south of Woolpit.
So pretty local.
Very local. And the Cistercians had an incredibly tight, sophisticated network of communication across their monasteries. Ralph includes specific, granular, local details in his account that William of Newburgh didn't have.
Which means he wasn't just copying William's homework.
Exactly. He was drawing on his own independent regional sources. He was likely speaking to people who were directly involved or maybe just 1 degree separated from the event.
Okay, that changes the context entirely. We have 2 highly educated, critical thinkers operating independently, treating this as a verified historical event.
Yes.
And back to your point about the anarchy, a civil war doesn't just breed rumors. It breeds massive, chaotic population displacement.
Precisely. If you are a chronicler living through a war where whole villages are being displaced, armies of foreign mercenaries are roaming the countryside, and supply chains are collapsing.
People are going to get lost.
Exactly. A story about lost, starving children wandering into a town isn't a fairy tale motif in that context. It's a tragic, everyday reality of wartime. A war-disrupted countryside is the exact plausible setting for displaced, traumatized children to wander into a strange town.
War orphans. The context suddenly makes the fairy tale feel incredibly dark and real. So let's look at what happens immediately after the villagers pull these kids out of the wolf pits.
Right, their initial integration.
They don't know what to do with them, so they bring them to a local authority figure, a knight named Sir Richard de Count, who lived a few miles away. Sir Richard takes the children into his home, but they immediately hit a massive, life-threatening crisis.
They refuse to eat.
Yeah, the children are clearly starving. You can imagine they are emaciated, their ribs showing. But when the household staff brings them food, the standard, wealthy medieval fare of roasted meat, heavy bread, maybe a thick pottage, the children absolutely refuse to touch it.
The chroniclers describe them weeping over the food. They examine it, but utterly refuse to let it cross their lips.
It's so sad.
It was as if their brains simply did not categorize the meat and bread as edible substances. They were actively starving themselves to death in a kitchen full of food.
Why would a starving child turn down roasted meat? Is it just extreme pickiness? Or maybe extreme fear of their captors?
It goes much deeper than psychological fear. There is a fascinating biological mechanism at play here that medical professionals call refeeding syndrome.
Oh, I've heard of that.
It's very serious. When a human body enters a state of severe, prolonged starvation, its entire metabolism undergoes a radical shift just to survive. Normally, your body breaks down carbohydrates into glucose for energy.
Right.
But when you are starving, there are no carbohydrates. So to keep your brain and vital organs functioning, your body starts cannibalizing its own fat and muscle stores.
It's essentially eating itself to stay alive.
Exactly. And during this starvation phase, the body's store of crucial intracellular minerals, specifically phosphate, magnesium, and potassium, becomes severely depleted, even if the blood levels look somewhat normal.
Okay, so the tank is totally empty.
Completely. Now, imagine you take a person in this fragile metabolic state and suddenly feed them a rich, dense meal of roasted mutton and heavy wheat bread.
A massive influx of calories and carbohydrates.
A massive, sudden influx. The moment those carbohydrates hit the digestive system, the pancreas detects them and releases a huge spike of insulin to process the sugar.
Makes sense.
But this insulin surge acts like a violent alarm bell. It tells the cells to rapidly pull in glucose to create energy. But to synthesize that energy to create a molecule called ATP, the cells desperately need phosphate.
Which they don't have.
Right. So the insulin spike forces all the remaining phosphate, magnesium, and potassium out of the blood and into the cells all at once.
And what does that do to the body?
It causes a catastrophic drop in blood serum levels of those electrolytes. Without enough phosphate and potassium in the blood, the respiratory system can fail, the nervous system short circuits causing seizures, and the heart muscle simply stops working.
Oh my God.
Introducing heavy, rich food to a profoundly starved body can literally trigger cardiac arrest. It is often fatal.
So the children's intense physical revulsion to the meat and bread wasn't just fear. It was likely their starving biology aggressively rejecting a sudden, heavy caloric load that would have killed them.
Exactly. Their bodies were protecting them.
That is staggering. Their bodies were saving their lives by making them nauseous at the sight of meat. So they're wasting away in this manor house until someone brings in something entirely mundane that completely changes the trajectory of the story.
The breakthrough.
Right. The servants bring in a freshly harvested crop of raw, broad bean stalks still in their pods. And the moment the children see these bean stalks, their entire demeanor flips.
They recognize them immediately.
They lunge for them. They are desperately tearing at the stalks, looking for the beans, and gorging themselves on the raw vegetables. For a long time, this was the only food they would eat.
The specificity of this detail is what historians love. It's not a magical elixir or a mystical herb. It's Vicia faba, the common broad bean, an ancient Old World crop.
So what does that tell us?
It tells us two crucial things. First, it implies a deeply ingrained dietary familiarity. They knew exactly what a beanstalk was and how to forage from it.
Okay.
Second, from a biological standpoint, raw green beans are mostly water and complex, slow-digesting carbohydrates with some plant protein. They are vastly easier on a compromised, starving digestive system than dense animal fat or heavily processed flour.
It's the perfect transition food. They essentially manage their own careful refeeding process through pure instinct.
Exactly. It saved their lives.
And as time goes on, the household staff slowly, carefully introduces other foods, transitioning them to a normal diet. But as they start eating normally, two profound changes occur.
First being their appearance.
Yes, the defining mystery of their appearance, the green skin gradually begins to fade. Over weeks and months, as their diet changes, the green dissipates, and they transition to a completely normal human complexion.
Which confirms that the green pigmentation was not a permanent genetic trait, nor was it a supernatural attribute.
It was temporary.
Right. It was an acute physical state entirely dependent on their environment, their trauma, and their severe malnutrition. When the environment and the diet changed, the biological symptom vanished.
But the second change is tragically heartbreaking. While they are slowly adapting to the surface world and are even baptized into the local church, the boy's health completely collapses.
It's a very grim reality.
The texts note that he was always the younger of the two, more lethargic, perhaps more deeply affected by the starvation or the trauma of their journey. Despite the food and the shelter of Sir Richard's home, the boy sickens and dies shortly after his baptism.
It grounds the narrative in the grim reality of 12th century infant and child mortality, especially for a body that has endured extreme physical stress. He just couldn't recover from the initial trauma.
But the girl's fate diverges entirely. She survives the trauma, she adapts, she is raised in Sir Richard de Cullen's household, working as a servant, and over the years, she learns to speak English.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
Exactly. The mystery shifts from their physical appearance to the words the girl finally has the ability to speak. Up until now, we've only had physical clues. Strange clothes, weird language, green skin, a love of beans. But now, she has the vocabulary to speak.
She can finally tell her story.
Yes, she finally has the ability to answer the burning question that Sir Richard and the villagers have been dying to ask for years. Where in the world did you come from?
In the testimony she gives, recorded so diligently by our skeptical historians, is where the story just explodes into this vivid, cinematic landscape.
We really got.
She doesn't just say, oh, we came from a town over the hill. She describes an entirely different reality. She claimed that she and her late brother came from a subterranean world she called St. Martin's Land.
St. Martin's Land.
Right. Named because St. Martin was the chief saint worshipped by her people.
And her description of St. Martin's Land is hauntingly specific. She says a place of permanent twilight, the sun never fully rises, full day never breaks, It is a constant, gentle, luminous dusk.
It's very atmospheric.
And she insists to her captors, every single person who lives in St. Martin's Land has green skin, just like she and her brother did when they first arrived.
The geographical details she adds are just fascinating, too. She describes standing in this twilit land and looking across a massive, uncrossable river.
Okay.
And on the other side of that wide river, she could see another land that was brightly lit, shining in perpetual daylight. It's a very intensely structured cosmology she is describing.
Sir Richard must have been hanging on her every word. So he asks her, if you live in a subterranean twilight world, how did you end up in a blazing hot harvest field in Suffolk?
And her answer is wild.
She explains that she and her brother were out tending their father's flock of sheep in St. Martin's Land. Suddenly, the quiet dusk was shattered by a great, echoing, ringing sound. Most versions of the text explicitly describe it as the sound of incredibly loud bells ringing in the distance.
They are mesmerized by the acoustic anomaly. The sound draws them away from their flock.
Exactly. They follow the ringing bells into a cave or a dark, cavernous opening in the earth. They wander deep into the pitch-black darkness, stumbling forward, completely lost, with only the echo of the bells guiding them.
A terrifying journey.
They walk for what feels like an eternity through this suffocating dark. And then finally they see a sliver of intense light. They crawl toward it, emerge from the mouth of the cave, and are immediately struck by the blinding, overwhelming physical weight of the midday Suffolk sun.
The contrast must have been horrible for them.
The sheer brightness of the harvest field compared to their twilight home disorients them completely. They panic, they turn around to run back into the dark, and they can't find the cave. The entrance is simply gone.
If we connect this to the bigger picture and analyze her testimony through the lens of medieval literature and folklore, what immediately jumps out is how perfectly her account mimics traditional fairy myths. The subterranean realm, the permanent twilight, the strange lights across a boundary river, the concept of a portal through a cave or a fairy mound, and the alluring, hypnotic sound of bells drawing mortals away. These are textbook motifs of fairy folklore.
It sounds like she is reciting a fairy tale perfectly.
Yes, but the crucial distinction is that she wasn't presenting it as an allegory or a myth. She was presenting it to Sir Richard as a literal geographical fact. She wasn't saying, I feel like I came from a fairy mound. She was saying, my father's sheep are still down there in the twilight and I want to go home.
Which is heartbreaking. I mean, imagine being the knight or the villagers hearing this. Do you dismiss it as a traumatized child's fantasy, or do you take it at face value because, well, the kid was literally green when you met her?
Right. For a 12th century listener, the line between the natural world and the supernatural was highly permeable. They didn't have our strict post-Enlightenment categories of physics and biology.
So they would believe it.
Absolutely. To a medieval knight or a peasant, the existence of lands beneath the earth or continents populated by strange races of people was entirely plausible. They believed that monsters lived in the woods, so why wouldn't green people live in caves? They likely accepted her story as the literal truth.
But we're looking at this from a modern perspective. While the 12th century villagers might have accepted the St. Martin's Land explanation, modern historians have their own theories. Theories that strip away the magic, but keep the tragedy.
Yes, when modern researchers cross-reference all the clues, the timing, the geography, the physical symptoms, and the political climate of the anarchy, a highly grounded, incredibly compelling historical theory emerges.
The leading modern theory.
Exactly. It is the leading consensus among scholars who study the Woolpit case, and it all centers around the massive wave of Flemish immigration into England during the 12th century.
Let's expand on that. When we talked about the anarchy earlier, King Stephen fighting Empress Matilda for the throne, it wasn't just a gentleman's disagreement between English nobles. It was a brutal, mechanized war.
And both sides needed soldiers.
Right. They needed professional killers, and in the 12th century, some of the best mercenaries money could buy came from Flanders, a region that overlaps with modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands.
England saw a massive influx of Flemish people during this time. Some were peaceful weavers and merchants, but many others were heavily armed mercenaries brought in by rebellious barons.
And how were they received by the locals?
Terribly. Because they were foreign, spoke a harsh, incomprehensible language, and were often brutal in their military tactics, these Flemish mercenaries were deeply, passionately hated by the local English peasantry.
They were viewed as violent occupiers, and this simmering hatred boiled over into a specific, documented historical event that acts as the linchpin for this entire modern theory, the Battle of Fornham, which took place in 1173.
The Battle of Fornham is the absolute key here. During this battle, a massive force of Flemish mercenaries, who had been hired by a rebellious earl, were cornered and decisively defeated by the royal army.
And this happened very close to Woolpit, right?
Incredibly close, near Bury St. Edmunds. But the tragedy didn't end when the opposing armies clashed. When the mercenary lines broke and the Flemish soldiers scattered into the countryside, the local Suffolk peasants seized the opportunity for revenge.
The people who had been terrorized by them.
Exactly. Armed with pitchforks, scythes, and flails, the local forces hunted the fleeing mercenaries through the woods and swamps, systematically slaughtering them.
It was an absolute massacre.
Yes.
So if we take that documented historical horror and apply it to our mystery, it leaves us with a highly plausible, devastating scenario. Armies in the 12th century didn't travel alone.
No, they traveled with massive baggage trains, camp followers, wives, and children.
Right. When the massacre at Fornham happened, the adult Flemish camp followers were likely slaughtered alongside the soldiers. In the chaos and the blood, you can easily imagine two Flemish children whose parents have just been murdered, fleeing into the dense, dark woods of Suffolk to hide from the peasant mobs.
It paints such a bleak picture.
They wander the forest for days, terrified, lost, and starving, until they blindly stumble out of the tree line and fall into the wolf pits at the edge of Woolpit.
And this historical framework perfectly explains the first two pillars of our mystery.
The language and the clothes.
Right. First, the language. To an isolated 12th century English farmer, the Dutch or Flemish language spoken by these traumatized children wouldn't just sound foreign, it would sound entirely alien.
Like frantic babbling.
Exactly as the chroniclers described. Second, the strange clothing. The Flemish were the premier textile producers of Europe at the time. The unidentifiable weave and cut of the children's garments could easily be explained as high-quality Flemish manufacturing.
Which was totally distinct from the rough, homespun wool of an English peasant. Okay, so the language makes perfect sense. The clothes make perfect sense. The brutal context of the Civil War provides the exact mechanism for them being orphaned, displaced, and profoundly traumatized.
But there's still the green skin.
Yes. Okay, what about the green skin? You can fake an accent, you can wear weird clothes, but you cannot fake being bright green. If they're just Flemish refugees fleeing a massacre, why on earth were they green?
This is where the historical detective work intersects brilliantly with the history of medicine. The leading medical hypothesis that explains the green skin is a very real, heavily documented physiological condition known as chlorosis.
Chlorosis. And if you look at historical medical texts, especially from the Victorian era, it literally used to be called the green sickness, right?
Exactly right. Chlorosis is a specific, severe manifestation of hypochromic anemia. Historically, it was deeply linked to poor diet, severe malnutrition, and most importantly, a profound systemic iron deficiency.
Wow, okay.
It was heavily documented in early medical literature as producing a genuine greenish pallor, often affecting young, malnourished women.
So how does a lack of iron turn a human being green? Is it like a plant losing its chlorophyll?
That is actually a phenomenal analogy. Think about what iron does in the body. Iron is the crucial component of the heme group in a red blood cell. It's what allows the blood cell to bind to oxygen, and it is precisely what gives blood its rich red color.
Okay, I'm with you.
When a person is in an advanced state of starvation and their iron stores are completely depleted, their body cannot produce sufficient hemoglobin. Without the red pigmentation of healthy blood flowing near the surface of the skin, the underlying biological layers become visible.
And what color are those layers?
Well, the subcutaneous fat and the connective tissues of the human body naturally possess a slightly yellowish-greenish tint. When you strip away the masking effect of the red blood, that underlying sickly yellowish-green hue dominates the complexion.
It's like a faded photograph where the red ink is degraded, leaving only the yellow and green layers visible. This is where the puzzle pieces of the Woolpit mystery just snap together with terrifying, brilliant precision.
It all aligns so perfectly with the timeline.
Let's trace it. You have two Flemish children hiding in the dark woods for weeks, hiding from the people who slaughtered their parents. They have zero access to food. They're profoundly starving.
Which triggers acute chlorosis.
Right. Their hemoglobin drops, the red fades from their skin, and they literally turn green. They wander into Woolpit. Sir Richard takes them in. He offers them heavy, rich medieval food, meat, and bread.
And as we discussed with refeeding syndrome, their starving, biologically fragile bodies aggressively reject it.
But then someone hands them raw broad beans. They recognize the beans from their agricultural life back in Flanders, and their compromised stomachs can actually digest the simple carbohydrates, so they gorge on the beans.
And here is the medical ticker. Broad beans are exceptionally high in dietary iron.
Wait, really?
Yes, the beans were quite literally the exact medicine they needed. By gorging on the broad beans, they were unintentionally treating their own severe hypochromic anemia.
That is unbelievable.
As they consumed more iron, their bone marrow started producing healthy, iron-rich hemoglobin again. The red blood cells repopulated their circulatory system, and just as the medieval texts meticulously recorded, as their diet normalized, the green tint slowly faded away.
Replaced by a normal human complexion. So what does this all mean? The beans cured the green sickness. When you stack the brutal history of the anarchy, the linguistic isolation, the physiology of starvation, and the hematology of chlorosis together, the fairy tale vanishes.
It becomes a completely grounded historical event.
We aren't looking at aliens. We aren't looking at supernatural beings from a magical realm. We likely have deeply traumatized Flemish war orphans, suffering from severe anemia and starvation, whose parents were violently murdered.
And when the surviving girl finally learned English years later, she was a deeply traumatized teenager trying to explain an unexplainable horror.
To the very people whose countrymen had slaughtered her family. Which brings us back to her story of St. Martin's Land. When you view her testimony through the lens of extreme trauma, it reads entirely differently.
It really does. The twilight land of St. Martin wasn't a fairy mound. It was the dark, dense, shadowy canopy of the Suffolk woods where they hid for weeks.
And the blinding, disorienting light.
That was the shock of emerging from the forest canopy into the glaring midday sun in the harvest field. The wide, uncrossable river she described was likely just a geographical memory of the sea separating England from her true homeland in Flanders, or just a local river they couldn't ford.
Okay, but what about the bells? And the cave?
The bells could have been the actual church bells of Bury St. Edmunds ringing out across the countryside, echoing through the trees, guiding the lost children towards civilization.
And the cave?
The cave was simply the dense thicket, or the literal wolf pits they fell into and crawled out of. When a child's mind is subjected to the incomprehensible violence of a massacre and the slow torture of starvation, it often fragments.
It makes up a story to cope.
Exactly. It constructs a narrative, a twilight land of peace, tending sheep and ringing bells, to shield itself from the brutal reality of what actually happened. It's a profound, tragic, psychological defense mechanism.
It's an incredibly powerful theory. It honors all the physical facts recorded by the chroniclers while grounding them in human reality. But, as with any story told for 900 years, the facts get muddied. People want to add their own spin.
Oh, they always do. The skeptical historical position requires us to acknowledge that while the core of the story is likely real displaced children, the story acted as raw material that grew stranger with each retelling.
Let's talk about those unverified additions, because it's so important for anyone looking into this to separate fact from fiction. If you read about the Green Children of Woolpit online today, you will almost certainly see it stated as fact that the girl grew up, took the name Agnes Barr, and married an ambassador from King's Lynn.
It gives her this lovely, upwardly mobile ending.
Right, but this raises an important question about how we consume history.
It is crucial to explicitly emphasize that those details are nowhere in the original 12th and 13th century texts. Neither William nor Ralph ever record her name as Agnes Barr.
They don't mention a husband either.
They never mention her marrying an official from King's Lynn. Those specific names and marital details are later traditions. It's essentially centuries of fan fiction layered on top of the original accounts to give her a socially acceptable ending.
It's like playing a 900-year-long game of telephone. We have the original receipts from the chroniclers, but we have to ignore the static added by later generations who wanted a neat bow tied on the girl's life.
It's a testament to the human psychological need for closure. The original chroniclers were perfectly comfortable leaving the mystery somewhat open. She learned English, told her strange story, and lived out her life working in the knight's household.
That was enough for them.
Right. But later generations felt an intense discomfort with that ambiguity. We have to meticulously separate the documented primary sources from the folklore.
And even when we apply all of these modern theories, the Flemish mercenaries, the chlorosis, the trauma responses, the legacy of this single event is still incredibly potent today. If you travel to the village of Woolpit today, you will see that they have never forgotten.
No, they celebrate it.
The children are prominently commemorated on the ornate metal parish village sign, It remains this massive point of local pride and an enduring curiosity for visitors 9 centuries later.
The Green Children sit in a genuinely rare historical category. We have serious medieval writers grounding this in real, documented context. Flemish migration, wartime displacement, chlorosis. The theory works flawlessly on mechanical level.
Wow.
But no surviving archival evidence can definitively confirm the identities of these specific children or prove the Flemish theory beyond a shadow of a doubt.
And you know what? That ambiguity is exactly what makes it valuable.
Yeah.
We don't need to force a final answer. We can acknowledge the logical explanation of traumatized war orphans while still appreciating the enduring wonder of the mystery as it was experienced by those villagers.
I completely agree. Knowledge is most valuable not when it completely sterilizes the past, but when it helps us understand the context of an event while simultaneously recognizing the limits of what we can definitively know.
Because at its core, underneath the complex medical theories and the historiography, there's an emotional core to this deep dive. Think about what those 12th century villagers actually did.
It's remarkable.
They lived in an era of brutal civil war and extreme xenophobia. They found two completely alien, frightened, starving children speaking an incomprehensible language crawling out of the dangerous woods. And they didn't attack them.
They didn't cast them back into the forest.
They brought them food. A local knight took them in. Whatever the truth is, Flemish orphans, a medical anomaly, or a genuine portal to a twilight world, the real legacy here is plain, simple, human kindness in the face of the inexplicable.
That is the most enduring truth of the narrative. A community encountered the terrifying unknown and ultimately chose compassion over fear.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over on your own as we wrap up this deep dive. Even with the Flemish refugee theory and the chlorosis medical diagnosis making perfect logical sense, there is still the mystery of the bells in the cave.
The part of her story she never let go of?
The children never found the cave again. But if the trauma theory holds true, if they were fleeing the horrific massacre of their parents, what unspeakable real-world horror were they desperately trying to block out by inventing a peaceful twilight land of sheep and bells? And how much of our own personal histories, our own painful memories do we subtly rewrite just to survive the blinding daylight of reality? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into your sources. We'll see you on the next one.